All right, so check this out. September 2025, you've got two neighbors in East Africa making headlines for completely opposite reasons. First, there's Ethiopia. They just signed this massive nuclear deal with Russia, and Ethiopians are celebrating it. They are calling it the nation's path to true energy independence. But then you look next door in coastal Kenya, and you see people holding signs that say Sitaki Nuclear. They are flat out rejecting their own government nuclear ambitions. This split screen between Kenya and Ethiopia is not just about two countries, it's a turning point for the whole continent. Look, Africa is facing the worst energy crisis in the world. We are talking about over 666 million Africans who don't have electricity. That's about 85% of the entire global population living in the dark. The numbers are just staggering. Nigeria alone, about 86.8 million people without power. The DRC has nearly 80 million people. And Ethiopia, the country celebrating this deal, still has about 56.4 million people waiting for a steady light switch. And here's what makes this whole thing so wide. You've got Nigeria, Africa's supposed giant with over 220 million people, stuck with nuclear program that has been dead in the waters for decades. Meanwhile, these two smaller East African nations are racing ahead, but they are using totally different playbooks and getting completely different reactions from their own people. Nuclear power could be a real solution. It offers that steady, reliable baseload electricity that Africa desperately needs. Right now, only South Africa has a nuclear power plant, the Koberg, and it provides about 5% of their electricity. The International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the IAEA, thinks we could see over 20 African countries getting into nuclear power electricity generation. Capacity could jump tenfold by 2050. But even then, it will only still be a tiny fraction of Africa's power supply, maybe 1 to 3%. So on September 25th, 2025, Ethiopia made it official with Russia's Rosatom. They've got a roadmap. But back in March 2025, Kenya signed its own deal with Chinese nuclear corporations. And they did it while facing this huge grassroots resistance, probably the most powerful anti-nuclear movement on the continent. But this race reveals something much bigger. Russia is building these nuclear partnerships all across the Sahel. I'm talking about Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. They are creating a sort of nuclear belt that could change the politics of this continent forever. China is pushing into East Africa through Kenya, and America, they are just scrambling to keep up. So in this episode, we are going to get into it. How this energy crisis is fueling the nuclear race, why over 20 African countries are suddenly looking at atomic power, and how these competing visions could decide Africa's industrial future for generations to come. Let's get into it. To really get what's happening, you have to understand the backdrop. Africa's energy crisis is catastrophic because right now, Sub-Saharan Africa accounts for 85% of all the people on Earth without electricity. Back in 2010, that figure was 50% and is getting worse. The numbers really tell the story because in 2023, 565 million people here in Sub-Saharan Africa had no electricity. And even though 35 million new connections were made, the population grew by 30 million. The World Bank projects that at this rate, 645 million people will still be in the dark by 2030. This is why Ethiopia is all in on nuclear. The country runs on hydropower. Over 90% of its electricity comes from dams. That makes them incredibly vulnerable to drought and climate change. They've got about 7,910 megawatts of capacity right now, including from the new Renaissance Dam. But that's not nearly enough for their industrial ambitions. So when they announced the deal with Russia, social media just lit up. Young Ethiopians were posting videos, praising it as a sign of technological progress, For them, that September 25th agreement isn't just about energy. It's about aligning with a global power that they feel respects African sovereignty. But right across the border in Kenya is a completely different kind of story, because Kenya has already gotten electricity to about 75% of its population, which is really impressive by African standards. That's a huge jump from 37% just in 2013. And about 90% of their power is already renewable. So this movement, Sitaki Nuclear, started with people asking a simple question: why do we need nuclear when we are already a leader in green energy? The proposed site in Kilifi County was another problem. It threatened protected areas, the Arabuko-Sokoke Forest, the Watamu Marine Park. Local communities saw it as a threat to the very ecosystems that support their jobs in tourism and fishing. This contrast really gets to the heart of it. Ethiopia's top-down approach creates a buy-in for government policy, while Kenya's more open democracy allows for real community resistance. But both countries are facing the same fundamental challenge: how to power a growing economy. For now, South Africa is the only player, with its Kobe plant generating about 1,860 megawatts. But Egypt has 4 reactors being built by Russia. And like we said, over 20 other countries are exploring their options. September 2025, this was a huge month for Vladimir Putin's strategy in Africa. Because while the world was focused on Ukraine, Moscow was building something much more strategic right here in Africa: a nuclear empire stretching from the Sahel all the way to the Horn of Africa. And Putin's opportunity is Africa's desperation. You've got about 565 million people without power, and governments are hungry for solutions. So Russia's all-in-one nuclear packages, they start to look really good. Ethiopia's deal in September 25th was just the latest piece of the puzzle, because earlier in 2025, Russia signed nuclear deals with all 3 members of the Alliance of Sahel States. That's Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And these weren't random. This is a deliberate strategy to create nuclear dependence that will give Moscow huge influence over Africa's future, all the while getting around Western sanctions. Niger is especially important. It's not just political, it's about resources. Niger is the world's 4th largest uranium producer in 2022. So a partnership with Russia could create a fully integrated supply chain, from the mine to the reactor. The revolutionary government have kicked out French mining companies, and now they are welcoming Russia. For them, it's the ultimate symbol of sovereignty. You hear the same thing from leaders in Mali. They've explicitly said this Russian partnership is their path to true independence from France. For this Sahel state, is the final step. They kicked out French troops, brought in Russian military contractors, and now Russian technology will power their economies. When you look at the map, Putin's strategy is brilliant. He's building an atomic belt from the Atlantic coast through the Sahel, and now with Ethiopia to the Horn. It gives Russia access to uranium, to ports, to shipping lanes, and it builds long-term technological ties. The Ethiopia deal is the key that connects the Sahel to the Red Sea, and the timing is no accident. Western sanctions cut Russia off from its usual market, so Africa became Moscow's escape route to keep its global nuclear industry alive. But Putin's grand plan had one major blind spot. He never expected China to move just as aggressively into the exact same space, setting up a clash of titans right here in Africa. Then came March 2025, an announcement that nobody really saw coming. And it showed just how China's strategy in Africa is changing. Kenya signed a huge nuclear deal with the China Nuclear Engineering and Construction Corporation. It was a signal that Beijing is moving from just building roads and bridges to providing high-end energy tech. China's play here is aimed squarely at Africa's energy crisis, because globally, there are about 666 million Africans without power. But Kenya is a relative success story with 79% access. So for Beijing, Kenya is the perfect laboratory. They want to prove that nuclear can be the final piece of the puzzle to close that energy gap, all the while creating a technological dependency. Now, China's model is different from Russia's. Moscow offers these complete turnkey packages. Beijing is all about joint ventures and technology transfer. The deal with Kenya covers 19 different areas of nuclear infrastructure, training programs, and tech transfers, all designed to build local skills while making sure China keeps control of the critical systems. Kenya has become China's testing ground for a much bigger strategy. Since Kenya's power is already 90% renewable, it's the ideal place to show how nuclear can work alongside green energy. If they succeed in Kenya, it opens the door to Uganda, Tanzania, and the rest of East Africa. What makes China's strategy so smart is how it ties into their Belt and Road Initiative. We are talking about Chinese nuclear projects connected to Chinese-built power lines, powered by Chinese finance grids, and managed with Chinese technology. It's not just a power plant, it's total ecosystem control. They want to be Africa's go-to partner for energy transformation. So what you have is this strategic competition heating up. Russia and China are both fighting to be the ones who will power Africa's industrial future. China needs this market to justify its own massive investment in its nuclear industry. And the United States, they are offering promises of smaller modular reactors and some regulatory help, but they just don't have the state-backed financing and complete packages that Russia and China are putting on the table. But as Russia and China were busy carving up Africa's nuclear future, they both made the same critical mistake. They just assumed that African communities would sit back and accept it all without demanding a say in their own future. Now, the resistance in Kenya is started with a hashtag, a simple phrase from frustrated communities in coastal Kenya, Sitaki Nuclear. In Swahili, it means I don't want nuclear. And it grew from a local protest into a continent-wide conversation about who gets to decide how Africa gets its power. This movement wasn't started by outsiders. It came from communities who know what Africa needs to develop, but who are rejecting solutions that are forced on them from the top down. The people in Kilifi County weren't sold on government promises about energy security. They saw a nuclear plant as a direct threat to the ecosystems that have supported their families for generations. And they had a point. The proposed site was near multiple protected areas, the Arubako-Sokoke Forest Reserve, the Watamu Marine Park, and the critical coral reef systems. Marine biologists were warning that the hot water released from the plant cooling systems could bleach the coral and destroy the marine food chain. It completely challenged the idea that nuclear is automatically a clean energy solution for Africa. But Sitaki Nuclear became more than just an environmental movement. It turned into a powerful demand for democracy in how big energy projects are planned. Kenya's Gen Z, fresh off their successful anti-tax protest back in 2024, jumped on board. Young Kenyans launched these sophisticated social media campaigns on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. They made videos explaining radiation risk. They documented the environmental threat, and they mobilized people across East Africa. The messages went viral, amplified by Kenyans living abroad, and it worked. The success was historic. The community pressure reportedly forced the Kenyan government to scrap Kilifi as the site and looked at moving the project somewhere else, maybe near Lake Victoria. This is a massive victory for grassroots activism on a continent where this kind of big infrastructure decisions usually happen without any real public input. The difference with Ethiopia couldn't be clearer. While Kenyans were successfully challenging their government, Ethiopians were on social media celebrating their deal with Russia. It just shows the fundamental split in how different African countries are approaching this. The success of Sitaki Nuclear has lit a fire. It's inspiring similar movement across the continent, sending a clear message. Communities are not just going to passively accept whatever solution is handed to them from above. So in all of this, you have to ask, where is the giant of Africa? Why its smaller neighbors are racing towards nuclear power? The continent's most populous nation, Nigeria, is nowhere to be found. With 86.8 million Nigerians still living without electricity. Now that's the biggest energy deficit in the entire world. You would think Nigeria will be leading this charge. The question that hangs over all of this is, why is the continent's supposed leader so paralyzed? Honestly, the contrast is embarrassing. Nigeria has more people than Ethiopia and Kenya combined, but both of these countries have locked in nuclear deals, while Nigeria's ambitions are just stuck in bureaucratic mud. As of 2023, only 61% of Nigerians have access to electricity. Compare that to Kenya's 79%. Nigeria's failure here really points to deeper problems. We are talking about corruption, about red tapes, about political priorities that change every 5 minutes. This has killed multiple nuclear plants over the last 4 decades. International partners just get tired of the delays and move on to countries that can actually follow through. And the irony is, Nigeria is sitting on massive energy resources. The country has huge reserves of natural gas, which already provides 79% of its electricity. But the infrastructure is so bad, they can't even get that power to the people who actually need it. This inaction has had huge consequences for the rest of the continent. Nigeria's failure to lead has created a power vacuum, and smaller, more agile nations are stepping up to fill it. Countries like Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, they are positioning themselves as the new energy pioneers, while Nigeria, the so-called giant, is asleep at the wheel. The IAEA says over 20 African countries are now looking at nuclear, with capacity to grow tenfold by 2050. These nations aren't just talking about reactors. They are fighting to become Africa's new energy leaders. But Nigeria's absence also reveals something more worrying about this whole race. It's possible these new partnerships are creating the exact same kind of dependency that Africa has been trying to escape for decades. 60 years after independence, Africa is facing a new kind of scramble. This time is disguised as a solution to energy poverty. With 666 million Africans in the dark, desperate governments are signing nuclear deals that could lock them into technological dependence for generations. It's not European powers carving up the continent for gold and diamonds anymore. Now, it's Russia and China competing for uranium, for reactor contracts, and for control over Africa's industrial future. The parallels to colonial history are hard to ignore. Think about this. African countries have huge uranium reserves. Namibia produces over 11% of the world's uranium. Niger over 4%. Yet, the entire continent generates less than 1% of the world's nuclear power. We mine the fuel that powers the world, but we remain in the dark. It's a perfect example of how having resources doesn't mean you have security. A nuclear reactor is a 60 to 80-year commitment. It ties a country to one supplier for fuel, for maintenance, for everything. Russia's financing model is especially concerning. They typically provide loans to cover 80 to 85% of the cost, and the African country is left to pay it back over decades. Egypt's El Daba project is a perfect example. 4 reactors, all being built with Russian money and Russian tech. That creates a very long-term bond with Moscow. And when political tensions flare up, was to stop that partnership from becoming a tool of diplomatic pressure. China's approach seems a bit flexible with its Belt and Road financing and joint ventures, but it's still a dependency. A Chinese reactor needs Chinese fuel, Chinese maintenance, and Chinese support for its entire lifespan. And the African Union, its nuclear agency called AFCON, is struggling to keep up. It just doesn't have the resources or the authority to set common safety standards or to protect African interests in these high-stakes negotiations. This weakness allows outside powers to cut their own deals with individual countries with very little oversight. What's most concerning is how this is already reshaping politics. Countries with Russian reactors might feel obligated to back Moscow in the UN. Countries with Chinese plants might feel pressure to align with China. The leaders pursuing these deals believe they are choosing energy independence, but they may actually be trading one form of dependency for another, giving up their strategic autonomy for decades to come. 2 years from now, somewhere in East Africa, the first batch of nuclear concrete will likely be poured. But the real question, the one that will define the next generation, is this: will these reactors actually solve Africa's energy crisis, or will they just lock us into a new cycle of dependence? Based on IAEA projections, there are basically 3 ways this could go. The first scenario is accelerated development. Nuclear power takes off and it successfully closes part of the energy gap. In this future, we see capacity jump tenfold by 2050, requiring over $100 billion in investment. Russia and China establish permanent footholds, creating networks of nuclear-dependent states aligned with their global agendas. The second scenario is more selective. A few countries with strong institutions like Kenya or South Africa might succeed, but in most places, the project will stall. Even in the best case version of this scenario, nuclear will still only provide about 1 to 3% of Africa's electricity by 2050, well below the global average. Then there's the third scenario, stagnation. Most of these nuclear ambitions just fall apart because the money isn't there, and social opposition gets stronger. In this future, Africa pivots to its other abundant resources like solar. The continent's solar potential is over 482,000 gigawatts, more than enough to power our needs without the risk of nuclear. And Kenya's own story proves that renewable can work. They went from 37% electricity access in 2013 to 79% in 2023, and 90% of that is from renewable sources. That fact alone challenges the whole argument that nuclear is a necessity for development. The resistance is spreading. The success of Sitaki Nuclear has inspired people in other countries. Young Africans are increasingly asking if these partnerships are genuine solutions or just a new form of technological colonization. So the ultimate question for our leaders isn't just about choosing between Russia or China. It's about choosing between nuclear power and other energy paths that might actually serve Africa's interests better. It requires an honest look at whether you can really have technological sovereignty when you are tied to a foreign supplier for the next 80 years. This race between Kenya and Ethiopia, it was never really about atomic power. It's about something more fundamental. Who gets to decide how Africa solves its energy crisis? And that decision is still being made. One protest, one social media campaign, one partnership at a time. Now, if you are watched to this point, this is Frontline Africa, where we talk about geopolitics from Africa's own point of view, where we bring you this kind of story with the kind of details mainstream media wouldn't dare to attempt. Now, in these nuclear ambitions being led by Kenya and Ethiopia, and also the alliance of Sahel states, what is your opinion? Do you think it is a strategic pivot for Africa to look towards nuclear energy solutions to power up our continent? Because our continent is very, very deficit in power generation, and a powerless continent is a poor continent. That basically explains why Africa is still poor, because Africa is not powered up. Africa is more than 80% of the global total of countries without electricity. Go to the comment section and tell us what you think. Should Africa look towards nuclear or explore other cleaner energies? And if you want to see more of my content, maybe consider to subscribe and turn on those notifications. Or you can visit our website, frontlineafrica.tv, and get all the global news headlines tailored from Africa's perspective. We strip away all the propaganda. We strip away all the agendas and report it exactly as it is from Africa's own point of view. So visit the website and get steady update about everything that is happening in the world from Africa's own perspective. I am your host, Ezekiel Enejeta, and I will see you in the next one. It's a bye-bye for now.